Welcome to Love and Speak the Truth, a podcast with Sister B and friends. It might get messy, sacred to secular. Don't judge. All voices will be heard here. So listen up. We're going to explore the human experience through the lens of wisdom sharing and faith, with a worldview that might shock you, move you, even downright inspire you. Let me welcome the wonderful Dr. Sister Bea Hernandez. She is a physician and a Wheaton Franciscan sister. We will get a glimpse of her story, giving care to AIDS patients in the 80s and educating communities, dismantling prejudice and misinformation. She shares her passion for working for justice on all levels with insights into racism in our own communities and cities and how we are very much called to evolve. We encourage each other with a very essential desire to be listening, inclusive communities of faith while following Pope Francis's lead to create conditions or an ambiance of equality and listening to voices that challenge in the spirit of synodality. Well, hello and good morning, Sister B. It's so good. I'm calling you Sister B, and people call me Sister B too, even though I'm Brenda. You're Beatrice. But it's great to have you on the show today, and I'm really looking forward to getting to know you a little bit better and to hear about your ministries that you've been involved in over the years, as well as the big focus, justice, and your justice work, and anything that might inspire the listeners to understand that balance between peace and justice. So, welcome today, and how are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. Beautiful, crisp winter morning.
Yes, yes. So, tell just as we get started, maybe you can just share a little bit about your journey as a physician, as a sister. You know how you grew up in your own spirituality and how that's developed. Just a little bit of a way of kind of setting a context of the Sister B of now.
Okay, thank you, Brenda. I've been living the Franciscan vowed life since 1967, and the Wheaton Franciscans have been a wonderful home for me because they're a very open-minded and open-hearted congregation, and that has fit me just perfectly. I've trained as a hematologist oncologist at Rush University in Chicago and went to practice in hematology and oncology, which is blood disorders and cancer treatments, in 1984 in LaPorte, Indiana, and started the Cancer Treatment Center there. It started, of course, not just with caring for patients, but also trying to forward education about blood disorders and cancer treatment among the physicians and the nursing staffs at the hospital, as well as working very closely, of course, with the laboratory technologists who are an essential part of any hospital. While there, I was very fortunate to be able to participate in my first commitment, which is to justice and peace. I've been very interested in justice, peace, and integrity of creation work all my life. And in LaPorte, I had the opportunity to be a part of the city of LaPorte's Human Rights Commission for 3 years. I served on that at the request of the mayor of LaPorte. I was also there at the very beginning of the AIDS pandemic. And part of the work I was involved in there was educating the civic community as well as the hospital employee community about HIV and AIDS. You will recall that at the beginning of that pandemic, there were a lot of misinformation going around about how it was spread, how it was not spread, and fear. Fear was, I think, the catchword at the time around AIDS. And some of it was not unfounded because at the very beginning of the epidemic, we did not know that it was a viral illness, although that was suspected very early on. But there was very little known about how it was being spread. We really didn't know at the beginning. And so that fear got into the population. And then once we did know how it was being spread, sexually transmitted and through blood transfusions and unusual blood exposures, like in trauma situations, until once we knew that, then it was very difficult to get that information across to the public because the fear had already set in. So there was a lot of education around AIDS to try and dispel some of the myths that had grown up around it in order to dissipate some of the discriminatory practices and beliefs about AIDS. And it was a very difficult situation.
When you mention fear, fear is something that gets into the system, whether it's the social system or the human system, the bodily system, whatever, and we don't know how to get out of that. And today, because of whether it's misinformation or information that we sort of rebel against really understanding, that puts us in a situation of not trusting science, not trusting the experts. We see that going on not just around health issues, but around social issues, around religious and spirituality issues. And I'd be interested to know, as you've had all that experience in your medical ministry, and I want to say career, but it's more of a ministry for those of us who are living this way of life, serving people. How do we dispel fear and help people to get information that's helpful and positive for life and not just driving them into the negative?
I think one way is information. That probably comes out of my science background, that I have that as the first thing that pops in my mind. But I think that information is very important, and accurate information, but not given in an argumentative kind of way, because that could put people off.
Mhm.
I think we have to listen to people's fears and concerns and then respond to them with kindness and compassion in the process of education.
Mhm.
And that's what we did around the AIDS pandemic. You know, we brought in a specialist from Chicago to LaPorte to address the parents of school age kids who were concerned because they had heard that there was a case of AIDS in the school system, but we were able, thankfully, to protect the identity of that person. And so they didn't know if it was a teacher, another student, a maintenance person. No one really knew, but there was all this fear that their kids would be exposed to it and maybe catch it and so
Mhm.
on. And right now, you know, in this day and age when people do know a lot about AIDS, that seems ridiculous to even have that fear. But at that time, it was not ridiculous. People really were afraid that that was how it was going to be spread, was just through casual contact. So one of the methods I think that's important is addressing people's fear with kindness and with information, communicated compassionately.
Mhm.
The next thing I think is uh, to allow people to express not just their fears, but what their hopes are. Listen, you know, people who are afraid are usually afraid for a reason. And if we can listen to what their concerns are and what it is that they want to accomplish for themselves or their families, then we have a better idea of how to approach them with information and with compassion. So I think that those two things are really paramount when we run into situations like that.
Mhm. Sister B, your background as a physician, but more importantly, as a religious sister, how do you address things that really people don't want to touch into? Things like racism, a lot of the ism. Your justice work is bigger than just the medical realm now, but there are lots of social elements that draw people into succumbing to fear. Fear is their first response, and that has something to do with our cultural understanding now, understanding of some of these psychosocial concerns, everything from gun violence to the fact that we have a suicide rate that is out of control right now. I'm wondering how you've developed your own thinking and your way of being in addressing perhaps some of these social concerns now.
I think that the thing that keeps me focused on some of these social concerns is the belief that people are basically good at heart.
Mhm.
And I think that many times we get caught up in our fears and we let those fears direct how we behave. And I think about racism in particular. As a child, I had firsthand experiences of discrimination and racism, especially because I am of Mexican descent. I look Mexican, and I was in a city that was very much divided along racial lines. The city of Chicago is a wonderful city. Ethnic variety is everywhere, but still today, but even more so when I was growing up, it was a city of ethnic neighborhoods. And if you tried to live anywhere other than your ethnic neighborhood, it caused tensions. And that was rooted in racism. So it's something that is so ingrained in you that even if you become conscious of it and try to root it out of your life, none of us can ever actually do that because it's so much a part of our experience. And I dare say in the United States of America in general, that is true. All of us are affected by racism, whether we are conscious of it or not, because it surrounds us, not just in interpersonal relationships, but also in the systems that govern our lives, in the way cities are set up, in the way schools are set up, in the way funding for schools is allocated, uh, in the way grocery stores decide what neighborhoods they're going to put a store in and not. So you hear about food deserts, and that's an actual reality. So I think that racism and other isms that penetrate us so deeply into our cores can only be addressed if we become conscious of them. The first step is to admit that we are affected and that we act out of those deep ingrained values more than we would like to. And then have a little compassion for ourselves that we really can change our lives. We're never going to be able to get rid of that rootedness that's already in us. But if we become conscious of it and conscious when it's operating out of us and affecting other people, then we can begin to make choices about our behavior and be more compassionate about us because we cannot change what we feel. Feelings are not rational things. They are things that come from past experiences usually and affect how we behave, but we can choose how we behave. And the only way to do that is to become more conscious of what is motivating our action and then begin to choose in a manner that's consistent with our gospel values of compassion, of love, of hopefulness, joy. Those are the things that I think can overcome those isms. But the first step is becoming conscious.
Yes, I love that energy around that because it's the hopefulness is something that I've always admired and see in people who can move beyond what that fear perpetuates. The fear that we started talking about from your experience. And then I look at it, it's hard for people to recognize their own vulnerability, their own, what am I afraid of in that? How do I respond out of hopefulness and faith and that loving compassion that you spoke about?
You know, the Star Wars series of movies
Mm-hmm.
had a wisdom figure in there, Yoda. And Yoda's saying when he was teaching the Jedi masters that one of the first things he would teach them is that they have to overcome fear because he said fear begets anger, anger begets hatred, hatred begets violence. So fear is where we have to start.
Yes. It's exactly. It's something to do with educating ourselves, but also recognizing that when a person has been hurt and when a person carries their own woundedness, somehow that fear of that coming back to them again generates more. And so, yes, you have to deal with that.
And listening is one way to get over some of that fear, because I have found that if I listen to another person's story, they're not going to tell you their whole life story at one sitting. But if you get to know a person by listening to them, they will reveal a lot about their life story just through everyday conversation. And you begin to learn where it is that they are hurting, and you get some insight into why. And that leads to compassion. And I think that sometimes we're very quick to judge other people based on our own experience,
Yes.
rather than listening to theirs. And
Mhm.
I think that listening is such a underrated activity nowadays. I think that, well, not just now, but it always has been. I think people tend to listen in a way that relates what the other person has experienced to their own experience. And that, after all, is the only thing we can relate it to, is our own experience. But if we try to listen with openness and try to relate it to how I would feel had I experienced that, that gives us a little bit of an insight into the other person. And that will lead, I think, eventually to doing away with some of that fear of the other, quote unquote, the other. And we begin to realize that we're not so different. I think it was our recent president, Joe Biden, always said, we are more alike than we are different. And that's really very, very true.
Well, speaking of that particular understanding, some people really don't want to see the similarities. They want to accentuate the differences so that we can somehow hold on to that level of dominance, maybe, that will somehow keep us in a safe place, keep us apart. That sort of separatist notion, you belong in your neighborhood, I belong in my neighborhood. It could be country. I belong in this country. What's your work, justice work, helped you to come to terms with when you talk about, when you listen and hear people talk about differences, similarities? I think in the political climate we're living in right now, we don't know what the future holds, but I think people are fearful of their rights being taken away. You organized a meeting to do voting in a way, an educated process for understanding what the policies we were voting for and all these things. But that's one level that I think helped people to look at that external, um, and how do we add the internal, moving out of fear into understanding, to be able to help us to make better decisions, better choices. I'm not sure if there's an easy answer to that.
No, there isn't, I don't think. When I think about people who are trying to protect themselves, that's really what it boils down to. Trying to protect your status in society, trying to protect your financial well-being, trying to protect your children, trying to protect your possessions. That's when we tend to view the world in a we versus them stance. And those kinds of divisions are very powerful because they come from the human evolutionary stance of fight or flight. If we feel threatened, our natural instinct is to either run away or to fight. And that's where this feeling of we versus them, it's so ingrained in us, but it's also what has allowed us to survive as a human species and to evolve. But we are now at a point where we need to evolve into a we together as one, not a we versus them, because the we versus them now has the potential to destroy the entire planet. to destroy the human species, at least on the planet, and many other species with us.
Yes.
So we are at a point in our evolution that we need to let go of that fight or flight mentality. But it's so instinctive. It's not something that we choose. It's something that will automatically come up in us when we are faced with something that we fear. And so I think that is the imperative, I think, of our day, is to begin to create relationships with one another, one-on-one, city to city, rural community to rural community, country to country. And we have a very unique situation right now where we have the power to do that. We have the internet. We have all kinds of social media ways of communicating with one another. Right now, I communicate with a sister, an Assumption sister of Nairobi in Kenya, Africa, who serves people with HIV and AIDS. And our Wheaton Franciscan community helped establish that ministry with her community, which is the Assumption Sisters of Nairobi. And we have been in communication, support for one another. We know what's going on around AIDS in Kenya because of that relationship. And it's been a marvelous blessing, not just for them in Kenya trying to serve people suffering with HIV and AIDS, but it's been a blessing for us because it's made us aware of problems we would never have even known about if it weren't for that relationship. So the relationship building possibilities now are really worldwide. And the powers that be in governments around the world know this. Just think about how fear is used to motivate people to do things to one another that they would never do otherwise. I'm thinking, for instance, of wars. People do not enjoy going to war. Ask anybody who served in the military in a war setting and has been deployed to face the violence of war firsthand. And they will tell you they never want to see another war. And it's because even though our fight instinct is so strong for survival, our hearts have evolved to such a point that we know that in our essence, we are all one. We are a we, we're a global we. And the things that divide us are constructs that are sometimes used purposely to maintain power for certain people. And it's the old Roman Empire motto, divide and conquer. That's what they used to conquer the then known world, was by using fear and dividing people against one another based on what they knew those fears were. And isn't that what we're seeing today?
Yes, yes. I'm curious to know if you think that this idea of building relationships is a type of anecdote, a type of process that will help us to work on that fear flight nature that we have. And I think one of the things, and I'm just going to say from my own perspective, I think that's one of the things that living religious life through these centuries and decades that the Catholic tradition, we've had this model of living community, each according to their need, conversation, relationship building. That's something we can model because we have lived it. Do you think that relationships, building those relationships, social ones, and even the internet could help us to kind of get over that self-centered way of proceeding?
I think that's the only thing that can help us is building relationships, and preferably reaching out to build relationships with those who are not naturally a part of our circles. We live still in a rather segregated and divided country and world. So I think the more we can build relationships with people who are not a natural part of our circle helps us to overcome the fear, because the fear is based on viewing the person as other and not as a part of the human family together, the we. So I think that's the only thing that can do it, is building these relationships. And I frankly really believe that people who are trying to hold on to power, trying to hold on to money, trying to hold on to all these things I mentioned before, are using fear to divide, because they know if the people at the grassroots are divided from one another, then they can just keep going on their merry way and control everything, because when you're divided, you have no power. I just have seen personally and experienced that building relationships leads to understanding, and understanding dissipates that fear as it deepens. So as you deepen relationship and compassion for one another, and begin to see the other as part of the we, then it's hard to do negative things to one another.
Right.
Whether it's gun violence, whether it's war, whether it's, hoarding the goods of the earth for ourselves because of a mentality of scarcity instead of a mentality of abundance. The world has a lot of resources, and the experts say that there's more than enough food to go around the world and provide for everyone. But it's the distribution, it's
That's
the
right.
hoarding, it's the wanting to have more and more. And that automatically means someone else is going to have less and less. When the Sustainable Development Goals were first put out in, I think, 2015 by the UN, one of them was to do away with hunger worldwide by 2030. We're definitely not going to make it. But why are we not going to make it? We're not going to make it not because there aren't enough resources, because all those institutions that know about global resources, like the World Bank and the Monetary Fund, they said, yes, this is an attainable goal. They didn't believe we would get there, but they did say, yes, it is something that could be accomplished.
Yes.
But it can't now, right now, I don't see how we can accomplish it by 2030 because of the wars. As long as are wars going on, you can't get aid into where it's needed. You can't get people fed. You can't develop agriculture in sustainable ways in countries that are at war, especially if they're using landmines in the fields. But it is, by saying it's not sustainable, it's not an accomplishable goal by 2030, is not to say that I don't think we can do it. We can do it. It's the will to do it and the mobilizing of everyone around the world to demand that our governments do it. That's what's needed. And relationship building will lead us there. It's like Martin Luther King said, the world bends towards justice, but that doesn't mean we're going to accomplish it in our lifetime.
Yeah. Yeah.
But why do we keep at it? Why do we keep working at it, though? Because for our own integrity, we have to.
That's right. Yeah.
If we don't, then we are relinquishing our own power. If we refuse to work toward the we, then we might as well just throw in the towel. That's what we're doing, is throwing in the towel.
And these small steps taken to build that coalition of not only power and money and finances, but a consciousness that all of our survival, all of our success, all of our communities, we are dependent on one another. I am much more conscious of that now, having had experience in other parts of the world, that my success, my achievements, my survival is directly linked with the people who are without or people who have less. Someone spoke to me the other day about the number of billionaires that we have in our country today. And there are a couple of billionaires who have the resources to literally end world hunger today. They have the resources to do it. Do we have a consciousness that will allow that? Because, we have God-given imagination to create some of the most amazing things. And at the same time, we have a human dark side that tends to shut that out, And how do we, as religious women, do you think, model a way of communicating for understanding our responsibility to build relationships and coalitions and in order to get the dire needs met in the world. That's the justice work, isn't it?
Yes. I think that you already mentioned one of them, and that is how we live in community.
Mm-hmm.
Those of us who are earning a good salary during our ministry time give it to the community, and then the community distributes it to all members according to their need, as was recorded in scripture in the gospels that the early Christian community did too. And we live in multicultural communities many times with people from all sorts of backgrounds who have joined the community and then live together, work together, sit in meetings with one another and listen to one another. And we've learned to listen to one another much more in recent decades than in the past, when many times the superiors had more to say than anybody else. That's no longer true in religious communities. We're listening to one another in a circle of equals. That has really led to a strengthening of our way of life and an ability to bring compassion then not only to one another, but to those that we minister to.
That's
So
right. That's
it
right.
it just shows you that by becoming a listening person and a person of compassion, you then can change the world because you're carrying that with you everywhere you go. Everything you do becomes inspired by that new understanding of compassion and love that has been strengthened through those relationships. So I think that it all goes back to building these relationships.
Yeah.
And that's why I think using telecommunications of all types is what has made our world a much smaller place. You always hear people saying, oh boy, the world is really getting smaller, isn't it? Because they can reach out to people in other countries on the other side of the globe. You just have to watch the time zones, but you can have conversations with people anywhere in the world in a matter of seconds. You can even do that with video now, where FaceTime and all these other things. You can reach out not just with words and email, but also with voice, with video. It's as if they're in the same room with you. And I think we learned that even more during COVID, when we could not gather in large meetings. We could not get together with friends. We could not have one-on-one conversations or even group conversations in large groups. But we learned that we could still be in touch with one another. And as a matter of fact, we had big community meetings in our community, all on teleconferencing of one type or another. And it was very successful. We did not lose touch with one another. Matter of fact, I think we had even better participation because everybody could hear well on their computer. I think that we really learned that the value of keeping in touch with one another and the power of the internet to allow us to reach worlds that otherwise we would be lucky if we ever visited in our entire lives.
And isn't it amazing that our own Pope Francis has modeled his way of listening and relating to people and allowing us to be a church, a community of believers, people of God, to sit at a table and listen to one another. This synodal movement has really taken root in where we need to go in order to be in relationship with one another, and a very diverse group of voices coming together. He's modeled that.
Yes, and I think the one thing that the Vatican Synod also modeled was the importance of when we do meet with one another, that we try to create an ambiance of equality with one another. The bishops sat at tables with cardinals, with priests, with religious, with lay people who were invited representatives to these meetings. They sat at round tables of mixed groups. The bishops weren't all sitting together. The cardinals weren't all sitting together. Even the Pope sat at a round table with other folks from other ways of life, and they had to listen to one another. They used a process where each person at the table got to speak and say from their experience what they needed to say. And the others had to listen. And they had facilitators at every table so that if someone was cutting somebody off or whatever, the facilitators would make sure they gently brought them back and let everyone speak and everyone else listen.
Mhm.
And Cardinal Supich recently gave a summary in Chicago about his experience at this last Synod conference in October. He said the thing that he thinks it accomplished the most was teaching all of us to listen.
That's right.
And allowed the people at that table, because they were always at the same table, they were able to build relationships during those meetings. And they came away, even people who were opposed to even being there, he said a couple of them actually had tears in their eyes and said, I am so grateful for this experience.
Mhm.
So it doesn't mean that policies are going to necessarily change immediately, but the mere fact that they had to sit there and listen to someone who they never had listened to before helped
Mhm.
them to realize, wow, this is really powerful. And hopefully we'll take it back to their diocese and try and figure out a way to have those multiplicity of voices at their own round tables.
Yeah, it's the first step in the process
Yes,
that invites us into relationship, isn't it? Is to listen to one
exactly.
another.
Exactly.
And I love it say that, listen with respect.
Yeah.
There's an openness that has to be there too.
One more thing, I think that we're so, especially here in the US anyways, the country I know, that we are so motivated by accomplishing things. We have a get out there and do something about this. If you see a problem, get out there and change it. Get out there and do something. And I am certainly one of those people. I'm one of those doers.
Mhm.
But I also think that sometimes we get too hung up in accomplishing something, and we undervalue the power of transformation of consciousness. That's what we really have to work at. And if we can become a listening, compassionate person, then our very presence and our way of interacting with people and our way of being in the world will begin to change things.
Yeah.
I really believe in the power of transformation of consciousness. If we do that, every person that we touch will be changed to some degree. I'm sure that you could think of people in your own life whose maybe one action or one conversation changed your life in some very, very deep way. And
Yeah.
I think most of us can relate to that, can think of someone who touched us either for good or for bad in a very, very deep way that changed our lives and that we carry with us. So if we really believe that, then that's what we have to work on, the transformation of our own consciousness,
Mhm.
not so much changing the world, because we believe that that transformation does change the world little by little, one person at a time, one interaction at a time.
That's absolutely right on. For me, when you ask that question, I'm sure you can think of someone who changed your life beyond my little mother, who was my greatest inspiration of all time. I would have to say immediately it came to my mind, Sister Eleanor Holland, who was the one that put it into my imagination. You'd make a good sister. And I never, ever thought of that as an option. And I went away to university, and it didn't leave my mind completely, even though I went wild. Yeah. I went wild. Anyway, I think we've come to this transformation of consciousness and that desire to be in relationship in order to change the world. For me, that's that constant movement into the personal transformation to be a person that advocates for and witnesses to the way justice works in the world. So thank you for giving me that insight into the process of getting there. We all receive it in different ways, huh? In different
That's
ways.
right. That's right.
Usually I sort of end the conversation with this idea of, if you had one truth that you live by in your life, throughout your life, what would that one truth be? That the name of this podcast is Love and Speak the Truth. And so I like to end with that one truth.
I think the one truth that guides me is the belief, deep belief, that each of us, by how we live, does change the world, either for better or for worse. And so if we want to see a more just, a more loving, a more fruitful earth and world, that's what we have to foster in our own lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I really believe that if I could change myself for the better in even a small way every day, then I am contributing to the world that I want to see for the future.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your perspective and your desire for a more just and relational world. And we are one big community. We just have to see it in each other and acknowledge that.
That's
So
right.
thank you, Sister B. Coming from one Sister B to another Sister B, I am so grateful that you said yes to have this conversation with our little audience. And we look forward to more of these pearls of wisdom from you in the future. Thanks so much. And now for the wrap up. You have just had a human experience from a spiritual being. We have so much to learn. So go forth to love and speak the truth. Ad majorem Dei Gloria.